How did the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft affect early Dungeons and Dragons, the way it was written and the way it developed? Appendix N chats are a place where I talk about literary influences on D&D using, at least at this point, the official, inverted commas, list of influences on D&D in first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, where it kind of says, oh yes, this is a list of the books that have influenced me most. Lovecraft is there, no specific tale, but we know that Gary Gygax, the creator or co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, read him widely. Lovecraft's interesting because some authors you say here's one element or two elements from that author that are important. Some are really big structural elements, law versus chaos in Anderson and in Moorcock. Some are like, this is just like a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, so Conan is great for that. Lovecraft, there are bits and pieces all over the place, but really the big thing for Lovecraft is just monsters and the idea of dark gods. That's the big influence on Gary Gygax. And it develops what you see in later eras of Dungeons and Dragons. In the 90s, maybe the greatest adventure designer of all, Bruce Cordell, introduces what we now call the Far Realm, this Cthulhuid realm beyond the known universe of Dungeons and Dragons, and that those things are constantly breaking through, mutating, warping, very much in that sense at the cosmic horror end of things, and that's very influential still in D&D. But there is a gap between the early 80s and the mid 90s when that happens. In the 70s and 80s, what do we have that shows direct and meaningful influence of Lovecraft? Well, the most obvious example is not actually by Gary, but it is by two of his closest friends and who were in his group, his original group. Here we go, Deities and Demigods. This is the first or second printing, because it has the later removed because maybe breach and copyright, who knows, Cthulhu mythos. And in here you have Cthulhu. You could fight Cthulhu. He has 400 hit points, immune to magical control, +2 or better weapons to hit, regeneration. He's 100 feet high with an octopoid head and a face of bloated or tentacle-like cilia. All creatures of nature are very sensitive to the presence of all creatures of the Cthulhu mythos. Got that warning signs if they're nearby. We have Azathoth, the centre of the universe. 400 hit points is good to know. You only need to do 400 hit points to damage him. Special defense is insanity. Any creature coming within 1,000 miles of Azathoth must save versus spells at -6 or go permanently mad. There's a certain silliness to this, isn't there? But yeah, you've got the Great Race. You've got Hasta the Unspeakable, who you've got his beer keys. You've got Migo, the fungi from Yugoth, who are in Whisper in Darkness. Primordial ones, who are in the Mountains of Madness. Shoggoth's also Mountain of Madness. Nyarlathotep, the Crawling Chaos, the Messenger of the Gods. And a few things about the Elder Sign, which is a small grey stone. And the Necronomicon, the Mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. So yeah, that is something you might say, well, how's that relevant to the early days? Well, it is an early book. It's a first edition book. I think it's first printing 1980, so we're talking about very early, in the era of the first edition DMG, in fact. But also we know that there was an influence on that table. Gary would throw out monsters. Some of those are basically Gary monsters, in fact, from what we know, even if their form here is not. They just, here's a crazy monster from Lovecraft. You've got to fight Shoggoth. And so yeah, that's the first thing, is just we know Gary used those monsters, and there are a few other monsters that pop up here and there, which, for instance, I think is probably fair to think of things like, that might not seem automatic Cthulhu, or might have quite reasonably other origins, but ropers, slimes, things like that. Lots of strange dungeon dwellers are a bit Lovecraftian in terms of just how uncomfortable and they are. And so, you can see all of that as potentially early days influence from Lovecraft on the early designers of the game. The most obvious influences are in a couple of adventures in the very early days. The first being pretty much the first published modules, were G1, G2 and G3, later published as Against the Giants, which is the first D&D review I did in this channel. which is a really nice module, great module, but where you find a few clues in a couple of places where there are basically, there's dark altars in the caverns beneath the fire giant's fortress. Let's see if I can spot it here as I pop through. Maybe not. But yeah, this idea that you explore around and you find something uncomfortable and unpleasant and that feels bad is something that comes up there. You explore, you find something weird. I say that, am I being stupid? It's in the Hill Giants, isn't it? Weird abandoned temple underneath the Hill Giants here. This room is a faintly glowing purplish green stone carved with disturbing shapes and signs which seem to stare out from the walls and columns to shift position when the watcher's back is turned, etc, etc. Basically it can drive you insane, and there are possibly some other things attached to that. So yes, there we go. You've got this thing, and there is something else I think in the Fire Giant's lair as well connected. So this idea there's just weird stuff beneath the ground, dark cults, abandoned ancient religions which we ought not to know about. This is an expanded, a few years later, 1982 publication date, WG4, Forgotten Temple of Tharisden. I've reviewed this as well, which is Tharisden, the Elder Elemental Eye, got a theoretical enemy or opponent associated with the much more famous Temple of Elemental Evil, but in fact, in both iterations of that, the Temple of Elemental Evil is a front being run by first Lolth and then by Zugdmoy. So that's one thing I should say. Abyssal demons, like the demons Tanari, are a little bit Lovecraftian in some of their modes, where they're at their most disturbing and warping, their most 40k the most 40k chaosy. You're being warped from the inside and exploding and mutating. That sort of body horror element coming in to D&D, which definitely demons have a bit of, is definitely Lovecraftian, to be fair. So even in that sense, Lolth and Zugdmoy especially, Lolth as well, like Driders, they're weird, aren't they? But here we actually have the Temple of the Elder Elemental Eye, Tharisden, this dark god, faceless grey statue, lilac statue, and it's just all weird and uncomfortable and unpleasant, and things get weirder and weirder as you go around. The Form on the Block is the name of a room. It's interesting, he mentions Rob Kuntz inspiring him for the subject material of the scenario. Kuntz may well then have been a Lovecraft pusher. But yes, strange, increasingly uncomfortable places. They get colder. There's a straight, you dared all and descended the spiraling purple steps formed by the strange columns of grey smoke, lilac light and jet black. There's all kinds of odd monsters knocking around. One of the great modern D&D writers, but very influenced by first edition, by Deities and Demigods, by the same sources we're talking about, Tony Huso. One of his modules, which I haven't reviewed yet, HU3, Mortuary Temple of Esma, really does touch on some of the same themes. It is his rewrite, really, of Forgotten Temple. It's very different, but it's very similar as well, and definitely amps up those Lovecraft feeling moments. Just weird things. You go into a room, there's a guardian demon there that's you have a weird experience with. There's black, green, red and blue idols which have different effects on you, and you don't know what's happening. Lilac and black room is who knows what it's there for? Who knows what this fallen temple now occupied by humanoids is? I actually think it's a thing that you see. I would say, and you can see on the back. There's grells and things like that, and Lovecraftian monsters too that Gary creates. I think actually that's something that Tony Huso probably perfects in Mortuary Temple, or at least articulates and drives forward. So yeah, I think the biggest obvious influence is there is a large suite of monsters accessible, either Gygaxian and other original monsters, Roper, Grell, etc., or specifically in the context of Deities and Demigods, an actual bestiary for that which was partly based on the fact that Gary would pop out with an astral Migo or something. So yeah, I think monsters, and then I think the fact that there are a few times, and I mean Tomb of Horrors is not far off this as well. Tomb of Horrors, for all its schlock, has moments like this. So do moments in D1 to 3, the Drow trilogy as well, where you just find a thing and it's strange and uncomfortable and it's freezing cold when you get there, or if you see it, you might go insane. That's a common thing. Lovecraft is therefore, in some senses, not as strong as influence as you would think, except of course he does influence other key writers like Moorcock. I think, though there are a few Lovecraft stories which really have the D&D feel, Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is a good example of that, and you can see why the Dreamlands has inspired Ben Lawrence's Wishery setting, which I have reviewed several books from. Thralton's Door is the name. Though that he's a great, that's certainly been an influence on D&D. Dreamlands are a weak influence, relatively speaking, on Gygax. No talking cats, no access to other worlds through dreams, and I think in that sense you end up being much more drawn towards, well, you can't actually have every adventure be an archaeologist wandering around, finding clues, getting confused, and meeting a horror that nearly breaks his mind. You have Call of Cthulhu, the game, for that, but D&D isn't that game, and I think that means the influence, though important, and though we perceive it as very big due to the development of that influence, particularly via Bruce Cordell and since with the Far Realm, I think in some senses it is less strong than might be advertised. Anyway, that is my take on how Lovecraft, an important but not absolutely first-tier influence on D&D, works. If you disagree, or if you've got a different way of putting it, I'd love to hear in the comments what your thoughts are on Lovecraft influencing D&D, and I bet you have some good stories about how there's some weird Lovecraftian stuff has crept into your Dungeons and Dragons games. So tell me in the comments. Till next time.